Igor.
Hello.
I'm not really big on questions, but I'm curious about Kundalini and Kundalini awakening. I don't consider myself a seeker. I consider myself the sought because things come to me. And so I have, I went to this presentation that's at an ashram near where I live. And, so my point was that I don't really know anything about Kundalini. Just saying it's not a history of mine, it's looking into different religions or anything. So I came upon this program they were introducing, Kundalini, and there's a leader at that church or that ashram that gives Shaktipat. So it was a presentation in preparation for that and introducing it. And they had this little video of a baby, and then it was like a cartoon kind of thing. And then everybody's born with it, and coiled up, and then when you get Shaktipat, it awakens the Kundalini, and then you have the possibility of uniting with the Supreme.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you want to sign up? And
Interesting. Are you taking notes then?
I was like, no, I don't get it. First of all, it didn't make sense to me that this was a couple of years back, so I was thinking, well, why would God make everybody with Kundalini that you had to be lucky enough to meet one of these people? And if you're born in the United States, you're probably not going to meet a Kundalini master. Why would that? That just didn't make sense to me, So, but I've had some exposure to different, mostly non-dual teachers, and it's not really talked about. Kundalini isn't a thing that's discussed very much, or Kundalini awakening. So the point in time did come. I kept going to the ashram just for meditation and different things. And I did choose to do Shaktipat, receive Shaktipat from that lineage. But when I did, I spoke very candidly with the center director there. And I said, I don't really have a belief in what this video is talking about and your presentation. I don't really believe it. I'm not interested in joining a church or joining a religion. However, I am open, but I don't want to be misleading, by doing this and saying, oh yeah, because I still, I did the Shaktipat. It was, a charge, but I still don't really know what Kundalini is. I still don't know if I believe that it's really a thing.
What was charged? You were charged?
Yeah, I kind of got a
Financially
feeling
charged?
of, yeah. When what's that?
No, the term charge means several meanings. You were charged with energy, or you were charged to your bank account?
Both, yes. I was charged, but they had a payment program, so.
Okay.
So maybe I didn't finish paying. So I just have a little bit, I don't know, and the only other person I ever heard speak about it really was you, that YouTube recommended you to me. And I was like, oh, thanks, YouTube. So, and then since I've heard you speak, now I see other Kundalini stuff, but it's just like people don't seem to know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And yes, so I would like to at least hear a little something from you. I don't have a specific question, but if you can talk a little bit about anything that I've mentioned.
Perhaps the reason why in non-dual circles and in a lot of modern spirituality, Kundalini is not spoken about is because there is not a single system of understanding that unites various traditions, and because there is also a possibility for some tremendous confusion. Because what we really speaking about here is not something that is taking place within our physiology. Although the clinical experiences of the awakening are full of the accounts and full of stories and manifestations that makes it a very physical affair. But because if we are to speak about Kundalini as what it really represents, then Kundalini is all there is. There's nothing else. The term Kundalini simply is linked very much with specific reference to the psychophysiological activity that is exemplified by the vital force of how it animates the entire being of who we consider ourselves to be. And there are more, if you will, again, more specific perspectives where it is spoken of in terms of a process. Let's say if we are to speak about Kundalini from yogic perspective, and there is no such thing as yoga, and then yet Kundalini yoga, right? I'm not even speaking about it with reference to the Yogi Bhajan system, who named the organization and his teachings under that term, Kundalini yoga, right? But if we are to speak about yogic practices, absolutely all yogic practices without exception, all of them aimed at nothing other than harnessing, activation, awakening, rising, culmination, repose, and return, and full integration of that force. All yogic practices. Some more direct, others more beat about the bush. There's no yoga without this. Kundalini is a chief deity of all yogas. Chief deity. This is why, for instance, myself, when I was learning about this post factum, when I was learning about it through scriptural essentially accounts that left and available and translated into English versions, mainly those that are affiliated and associated with Kashmir Shaiva philosophy, or the philosophy of Kashmir Shaivism as it is known. I found that the way it is spoken about in this tradition is the most complex, all-encompassing, and the most universal. So therefore, I prefer to speak from that, if you will, philosophical ground. Not that I'm not open to different perspectives, right? And it can be spoken. But if we are to speak about Kundalini, then Kundalini is not understood as just some kind of phenomena in the body that once unleashed gives being tremendous gifts, showers him or her with gifts. And in fact, that's how it's often spoken in many scriptures, yogic scriptures even. And spoken about that, certainly, it is spoken like that, certainly in New Age spirituality. In New Age, this is how it is spoken of, either directly or in more elusive, allegorical language. But really what Kundalini here is all there is. There's nothing else. There's no human being outside of Kundalini. In fact, we earlier spoke about ego and mind, right? And kind of like there was it was tad intellectual discussion to orient ourselves, at least in the first part, when I was responding to the question. But if we are to now redress this, the question of the ego here, to understand how ego is spoken in relation to Kundalini, then we would need to say that it is that portion of Kundalini which is fascinated with this embodied experience that we call ego. And it is only through the uncoiling and the expansion of consciousness that Kundalini is also known as. Kundalini is often spoken in yogic heritage as chitti, not female connotation. She is spoken of as chitti. And the unfoldment and expansion of chitti is unfoldment and expansion of our consciousness. So in other words, it hits hard or brings hard truth home that there's no way to know ourselves beyond our bodily egoic identity unless consciousness itself undergoes transformation. And that's why non-duality does not like to speak about it. Because non-duality is a chit-chat. It's a spiritual chit-chat. Non-duality is all about talking. It's a talking spirituality. You know? It still may be entertaining. It depends on the charisma of the teacher. If the teacher is charismatic, then it will be charismatic non-duality. If the teacher is boring, it will be boring non-duality. It's as simple as that. And anything in between goes. You see? So it will always have the color of the container it will be presented through. Right? But the uneasy aspect of it is that there is always Gnostic spirituality. There's always Gnostic way, Gnostic path. What is Gnostic path? Gnostic path is characterized by gnosis. Gnosis is a term that comes from the Sanskrit term gyan, jnana. The jnana became gnosis. You see? They are related. One evolved out of the other. Jnana here is spoken of as direct perception. So Gnostic path is to directly cognize. That's why that term cognize. English term cognize is inseparable from the term gnosis, is to bring something fully into one's awareness. But that is not by virtue of speaking about it. or even contemplating about it. It's a visceral process. So Gnosis and Gnostic traditions are characterized by direct transformation of one's consciousness, so it can be cognized, brought into full knowingness. You see? So when we speak like this, then Kundalini is all there is. There's nothing else. And that's how tradition speaks about it. It does never reduces it to some kind of phenomenon available to agitation, manipulation, and some kind of spiritual trickstery. Yes, there were attempts, and certain schools exist, that play with that energy. But right there and then, the dangers are being spoken of. And various dangers, you know. And dangers are not just dangers of what today the awkward or unlikely awakenings are in terms of the, you know, the work is that, you know, done by charlatans and people who don't know what they're doing. But also it is spoken of in terms of that, what this process really represents, what it really entails. There's no way to know ourselves beyond who we identify ourselves with, unless that what is the main principle of identification undergoes some kind of unraveling. So, and that's why there's not much talks about it, because really it's work. So some teachers may not talk about it out of great respect and reservation. Others may not talk about it because they don't have a clue, because they don't have any experience, and they sincerely cannot rely on the text they read. There are many scholars who talk about it, but they don't know it in terms of they haven't lived through it, and they're not living embodiments of that. Because one has to go through it, and even when one goes through it, it's not like one gone through it. You see? There's no end to it. Yes, there are phases, stages, loosely outlined earlier, right? But that it's not that process culminates and this is it, and we can say that, you know, certificate is given, right? Kundalini Yoga, you become a certificated teacher. Okay. Right, you raised your Kundalini to the level of Manipura chakra. Congratulations. Let me shake your hand. Next. And you are progressed beyond that. You go, you know, heart chakra. Oh, good. Oh, you know. And it's like stamp, yellow, green, mauve, right? Ooh, I can see your thoughts, my dear. I know what's in the certificate. You know, so this is like, it's not like that, isn't it? Some traditions that maybe have that affiliation with a specific yogic methodologies. You know, let's say there are not that many yogic scriptures that directly spoke about this. You can count them. And even the term Kundalini is, in terms of the vastness of that civilization, is a relatively new term. So the term perhaps appeared sometimes around the time of the what is considered to be as a spiritual renaissance in India, which kind of coincided with the arrival of Tantra as independent teachings. You know, Tantra arrived, and in Tantric scriptures, known as Shastras, the term Kundalini was freely used. So when we read the Tantric scriptures, then we will find, of course, that's this term. And later on, because that we speak about roughly maybe 4th to the 10th century, by which all greatest Tantras were recorded down, came forth, and even earlier commentaries were already already in circulation. And then we have this Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which arguably comes from 14th century and authored by the Rishi Swatmarama. And the term Kundalini is spoken of in that fully yogic vocabulary, and like even each chakra is described, all is described there. All this process is described minutely in that scripture. Of course, one would need to have commentaries, because it's still written in verse, compacted, very concise verse, as these usually texts are written. And so if one leans on this particular scriptural reference, then one might end up with what you perhaps felt as being too conceptualized, right? Too conceptualized, and if any subtlety somewhere is kind of relaxed, and one gives that accessible picture, through whatever, animated film, cartoon, or right presentation, then that might end up being that dry, dry diagram, right? As all these New Age books full of, where it kind of meant to give us a sense of that process. But it's not at all what it is like. Therefore, it is spoken of as a clinical experience and classical experience. Clinical means various accounts of those who had no idea and no cultural reference point. They were simply relating their experience, and these experiences are by large somatopsychic and psychosomatic. In other words, they are with reference to psychophysiological activity. And there are classical experiences. When we read classical experiences, they are then in turn filled with that richness of poetic connotations, which sometimes also takes us on the flights of fancy and fantasy about the process. So, what do we do with that? There are a lot of people out there, or at least quite few people out there, who are very considerate about this, and deep within the spiritual circles we touch this topic. Because it's becoming more commonplace, the awakening, especially the spontaneous awakening. I'm not talking about methodologies that someone follows or Shaktipat programs that meant to activate life force. But the people wake up out of the blue. People wake up in the presence of non-dual teachers, those who themselves didn't go through. People wake up in Zen monasteries, where this is not spoken, denied. So there is a need, of course, there's a tremendous need to understand this. Just now, the conferences like the one talked about, like Science and Duality, begins to kind of tentatively introduce and bring the teachers, but it's far from, let's say, hitting a panel. It's far from having a panel where people who know what they're talking about can sit together and discuss it, and so we are very much stumbling in the dark when it comes to this. Very much. And that has been the case for a very long time. For a very long time. So, what do we do? What do we make out of it? You see? Well, there's yet another perspective which perhaps would not complete the picture if we don't mention it, if we don't speak about it. And there is this perspective that we cannot speak about the collective shift or shift in collective consciousness. We cannot speak about birthing of a new paradigm or embracing reality that we all somehow deep down wish. Somehow beyond our limitations, beyond our preferences, beyond our shadows and beyond our blind spots, we know that we all share. If we are real serious about it, then it's not going to happen from, if you will, decision making. It's not going to happen from the place of kind of political or economical incentives and orientations. It's only going to happen from the place within. It's going to happen from the place where there is more awareness. So in other words, it's from the awakening of an individual to the collective awakening. Not that everyone will awaken or have to awaken. This is also, I don't necessarily share that kind of like a rosy perspective that suddenly we become all awakened as a human race. It's inconsistent also with the way many traditions speak around the globe. But what will suffice if the number of people present a critical mass? So in other words, it will suffice if in enough people consciousness lives in a different state qualitatively. Then that will affect there and then the collective state of affairs. But it's nothing to do with belief systems, right? It's nothing to do with yamas, niyamas and commandments. It's to do with the spontaneously rising within sense of that what really gives us sense of belonging of who we are, which takes us beyond the utmost limitations of what we consider ourselves to be, and brings us out and dissolves us into that what we actually born to be here. So it's a very interesting time to be alive. Interesting, but also uneasy time. Uneasy because you know that what we call reality is gripping. This reality is gripping, and everything is filled and brings this, that rising of that is accompanied by also that what simultaneously brings forth and creates the opposite wave. It brings the opposing wave, which in a way the leitmotif of all the epics, right? That when finally the light faces the utmost darkness, and that final hour of the battle, where light would have to consume that darkness, and that is so and cannot be otherwise when we speak of collective consciousness. So this is maybe why awakening becomes so commonplace. It's out of the bottle, the genie out of the bottle. It's no longer in highly guarded spiritual traditions. It happens in it can happen and does happen in any household. And this is very peculiar. Very peculiar. It was spoken about almost in terms of some kind of prophetic terms. Only some 40 years ago, like roughly. It was spoken in the 60s and the 70s in terms of that kind of prophecy that there is this awakening, this will become more commonplace. So in other words, it's where spirituality spills out of those groups which were kind of, the groups of people who walk the path, giving themselves to the work. It needs to be done means it awakens. Because more light needs to be, more pillars of light, let's say. More awareness is required. But how can it be more awareness here? And it is very interesting. Awareness cannot be just here, some kind of a white cloud floating in the sky, suddenly comes and restores the balance. It has to function through physiology, right? Because that's what we are. We live in the world which has form. Awareness is inseparable from the universe. Universe and awareness are one. So in whichever way awareness comes, it has to come through the highly evolved form, through the highest evolved form. Otherwise, we might as well give that evolutionary responsibility to whales and dolphins whom we slaughter like if there's no tomorrow, right? So it's not going to happen, I'm afraid, through dolphins and whales alone. They may be mammals and have a profoundly interesting analogous brain and nervous system. So it has to happen in a human being. So these are my 2 cents.
Thank you.